I was sitting in the back of a glass-walled conference room last week, watching a woman, let's call her Sarah, get systematically dismantled by her board. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was that polite, surgical kind of corporate cruelty. Every time she attempted to speak, she was talked over. Every metric she presented was dismissed as anecdotal or too felt. The entire time, Sarah stayed perfectly, unnervingly still. Her face was a mask of professional grace. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't let a single flicker of frustration cross her eyes. Afterward, a senior partner patted her on the back and whispered, "Great job keeping your cool, Sarah. Very professional." He genuinely meant it as a high compliment. Sarah just offered a tight, brittle smile, the kind of look that reminded me of fine porcelain just seconds before it shatters. But I noticed one detail the others missed. While her face was a monument to composure, her hand under the table was gripped so tightly around a plastic pen that the casing was beginning to stress and whiten. Her knuckles were ghost white. She wasn't managing her emotions, she was suffocating them. We've been trained to see that silence as a victory, the ultimate sign of a refined character. We call it poise, maturity, or high EQ. But watching Sarah walk out of that room, I realized we might have the whole thing backward. What if that celebrated calm wasn't a sign of strength, but the most sophisticated mask for resignation? We've spent decades psychologizing, medicalizing, and morally shaming anger, treating it like a primitive glitch in an otherwise civilized brain. But in a world that demands permanent adaptation and a smile in the face of the absurd, what if Sarah's suppressed rage wasn't a problem to be solved? What if it was the only part of her that still knew something was wrong? We are told that anger is a loss of control, but looking at those white knuckles, I started to wonder, what if anger is actually the last place where our dignity stays standing?
Wow, that is a really haunting image. Just the white knuckles under the table.
Yeah,
because it's this physical manifestation of a psychological civil war. Really, you have the so-called civilized brain saying, smile, nod, agree with the board.
Right, keep your job.
But then you have the body, the nervous system screaming that there's a danger, that a violation is happening. It's completely visceral.
But see, that's where I get stuck. Because, and I hate to say this if I'm being totally honest, I actually kind of agree with the board member.
Really?
Well, not with his cruelty, obviously not that, but with his assessment of her behavior in that specific moment. If Sarah flips the table,
she loses.
She loses.
Yeah.
If she screams, they just label her hysterical and security walks her out. In the real world, isn't that suppression, totally necessary for survival? I mean, we can't just go around unleashing our dignity on everyone whenever we feel slighted.
And that right there is the dominant narrative. That's what we're taught from kindergarten, essentially. But I really want to challenge the premise that those are our only two options.
What, suppression or flipping tables?
Right. That binary choice is part of the trap. In this deep dive, we're looking at anger not just as a behavior, like yelling or throwing things, but as a form of cognition, as an actual way of knowing something about the world.
A cognition, like thinking. Yeah. Because I gotta say, usually when I'm angry, I feel like I'm doing the exact opposite of thinking. It's just red mist.
Yeah, the red mist. And that view, what we could call the anger pessimist view, it has a very long, very prestigious lineage. If you go all the way back to the Roman philosopher Seneca,
the Stoic guy,
the godfather of Stoicism himself. He basically wrote the playbook for that senior partner in your boardroom story. Seneca called anger a departure from sanity. Lich. He argued that anger is like a shotgun. It just sprays everywhere. It's totally imprecise. So even if you are entirely right to be angry, Seneca would say your anger makes you sloppy. It makes you vulnerable. And ultimately, it makes you indistinguishable from the thing you're trying to fight.
And he kind of has a point, doesn't he? Look at mob violence or just, road rage. It's really hard to argue that a guy screaming in traffic is experiencing a high form of cognition.
Absolutely. Seneca isn't wrong about unregulated reactive rage, but there is a massive distinction that constantly gets lost in this conversation, and it's the difference between anger, resentment, and indignation.
Okay, because to me, those all just feel like different flavors of being mad.
Right, but it's not just wordplay. It's a structural difference in the brain and frankly in the soul. Anger, in its rawest, most primitive form, is just reactive. You step on my toe, I shove you. It's biological.
Right.
Exactly. Now, resentment is different. Resentment is personal, and it lingers. It's entirely ego-driven. You got the promotion I wanted, so I resent you. I want payback. It's about me.
Okay. And indignation?
Indignation is what philosophers call a vicarious attitude.
Vicarious. Meaning, like, I'm feeling it on behalf of someone else.
On behalf of someone else or on behalf of a principle, indignation is precisely calibrated to injustice. You witness a violation of human dignity, maybe it's Sarah being silenced in that room, or maybe it's a law that targets vulnerable people, and you feel this cold, sharp heat.
Yeah.
That isn't a tantrum. That is your moral compass screaming that magnetic north has shifted.
Wow.
Aristotle actually argued that if you don't feel that, if you can look at injustice and remain perfectly calm, you are morally deficient.
Hey, if I watch Sarah get bullied and I feel absolutely nothing, I'm not being stoic, I'm broken.
You're missing the data stream. You are blind to reality. And this brings us to Audre Lorde. She wrote this incredible essay called The Uses of Anger back in the early 80s.
Right, I read this one.
You have to picture her context. She's a Black woman, a lesbian, a feminist, she's fighting cancer, and she's living in a society that essentially wants her to be invisible. And constantly she's being told to be nice, to be bridge building.
The classic tone policing. We'd listen to you if you just said it nicer.
Yes. And she entirely rejects that. She writes that anger is a liberating and strengthening act of clarification.
Clarification.
We usually think anger clouds our vision. Lorde says no, anger blows away the fog. It's a spotlight that reveals exactly where the oppression is hiding in plain sight.
It reminds me of a fever. A fever is deeply unpleasant, right? You're sweating, you're shaking. But it tells you, undeniably, that there is an infection in your body. If you just numb the fever without treating the infection,
you die.
Right, you just ignore the warning light until the engine blows up.
Analogy. And this is what scholars call the epistemic value of anger. Episteme meaning knowledge. The idea is that the angry person actually knows something the calm person does not. Sarah, with her white knuckles, knew the board was lying. The board members, in their calm, polite arrogance, were actually living in a delusion. Sarah's anger was the only anchor to reality in that room.
Okay, I want to take this out of the abstract now. It's easy for us to sit here and say anger is knowledge when we're just talking about philosophy and boardroom dynamics, but I really want to see how this works when the rubber meets the road, because sometimes that so-called knowledge runs contrary to everything the entire world accepts as fact.
And that is exactly where it gets dangerous and honestly fascinating.
Right. So let's talk about Alara. This story really stuck with me. She was a senior archivist at a very prestigious, very old institution in London. We're talking about the kind of place that literally defines history for the rest of us.
White gloves, temperature-controlled, dust-free rooms, absolute silence.
The ultimate environment of composure. Everything has its place. Everything is settled. And Alara had spent decades there, cataloging the official history of the Industrial Revolution. You know, steam engines, coal, the rise of the factory system, standard textbook stuff that we all learn in school.
But over the years, she starts noticing things, gaps in the narrative, anomalies.
She'd find a ledger from, say, 1850. But it would be referencing a shipment of materials that simply didn't make sense for a steam engine. Specific types of quartz. Copper coils wound in geometric patterns that look significantly more like advanced radio tech than anything steam-powered.
But radio hadn't been invented yet, actually.
According to the timeline, no. But then she dug deeper and found the blueprints. And these weren't just rough sketches. They were highly detailed schematics for municipal buildings. But the buildings themselves were designed to act as energetic collectors. They were utilizing what looked like atmospheric resonance energy, drawing power straight from the air.
Okay, so we're veering into what's known as antiquitech theory here. This is the idea that the past, or at least a recently suppressed past, was far more technologically advanced than we are taught. It's a very heavy fringe topic.
It's entirely fringe. And look, for anyone listening, I'm not asking you to believe that these blueprints were fully functional, free energy devices. I'm asking you to look at the psychological and social interaction of what happened next. Because Alara takes these blueprints to her supervisors. She's an archivist. She thinks she's found a missing link in engineering history. She is expecting curiosity.
And instead, she hits a brick wall.
A completely soundproof wall. They gave her silence, not the silence of awe, but the silence of a closed door. They literally told her it was just a clerical error. They said she was misinterpreting decorative architectural flourishes as functional technology.
Right.
And when she pressed them, when she physically pointed to the complex math scribbled in the margins of these blueprints, they threatened her tenure. They didn't even attempt to debate the evidence. They just immediately attacked her competence and her sanity.
And that is when her knuckles turned white.
That's when the righteous indignation kicked in.
And this is a textbook example of a concept called epistemic violence.
I really want to drill down on that term, epistemic violence. It sounds very academic, but it feels so visceral, so aggressive.
Physical violence hurts your body, right? It damages tissue. Epistemic violence hurts your capacity to be a knower. It is when a massive system, a university, a hospital, a historical society, tells you that your literal perception of reality is inadmissible. It's not just them saying you made a mistake. It's them saying you do not make sense as a rational entity.
It's exactly like medical gaslighting. You go to a doctor, you say, I am in agonizing pain. And the doctor looks at a chart and says, well, the tests are normal, so it's all in your head. Take an aspirin. They are using their institutional power to completely erase your lived physical reality.
Alara's supervisors were committing epistemic violence against her. They were essentially saying, our timeline is the only timeline. Anything that falls outside of it is structurally invisible to us, and therefore it must be invisible to you.
So in that moment, Alara's anger wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't a tantrum. It was a vital defense mechanism for the truth.
It was a diagnostic tool. Her anger was the alarm bell telling her, I am seeing something real right in front of my face, and these people are actively trying to blind me. If she hadn't been angry, if she had just been professional and calm like Sarah in the boardroom, she would have gaslit herself.
She would have put the blueprints back in the acid-free box, filed them under decorative arts, and just forgotten about them.
Yes. Her anger was the actual fuel that made her quietly start making copies of those documents. It's what drove her to start an underground archive.
Which is so interesting, because from the outside to her supervisors to mainstream historians, Alara looks like a total conspiracy theorist. She looks like someone who just went off the deep end over some old drawings. But from the inside, from the perspective of her anger, she is the only person in that building acting with any integrity whatsoever. She is preserving the raw data that the system is trying to shred.
And that right there brings us to the profound difficulty of this whole concept. Yes, anger is a tool for truth, but it is a remarkably lonely tool. Because when you use it to challenge what academics call a majoritarian story.
Meaning the dominant narrative that everyone just accepts as natural.
Exactly. When you challenge that majoritarian story, you automatically get pushed to the extreme margins. You become the crazy person.
Speaking of the margins, let's move from the dusty archives in London to a totally different setting. Because Alara isn't an isolated case. There's an entire community of engineers, mechanics, and independent physicists who are essentially in open, angry revolt against mainstream academia.
Yes.
Right. Elias is part of this group in the American Midwest. These are independent mechanical engineers. And I want to stress, these aren't weekend hobbyists playing around on the internet. These are guys who build and machine complex engines for a living. They know physics intimately. And they became completely obsessed with the physical properties of megalithic stone structures from the ancient world.
So we are back in the Antiquitech realm.
But again, look at the dynamic here. Elias spent years developing a rigorous mathematical proof regarding acoustic resonance. He wasn't talking about ancient aliens or magic. He was doing hard physics. He argued that certain types of red granite, when they are cut to highly specific dimensions and subjected to a steady vibration of exactly 110 hertz, start to exhibit piezoelectric properties that could theoretically reduce their weight. Essentially, acoustic levitation. Which
is incredibly bold. I mean, 110 hertz is a very specific frequency. It's often associated with ancient chanting in sacred chambers, isn't it?
So Elias takes this math, which he has checked, double-checked, and physically modeled, to a traditional peer review panel at a university. He wants to get published. He wants to enter the scientific conversation. He walks into the room, sets up his presentation, and puts the equations up on the board. And do you know what the response was?
Yes. They didn't politely point out a flaw in his calculus.
They laughed. They literally laughed him out of the room. One professor sitting at the table actually asked him if he'd been watching too many science fiction movies lately. They didn't say, hey, you missed a variable on line 4. They dismissed the entire premise as fundamentally absurd simply because it contradicted the established, comfortable view that ancient people were exclusively using ropes, wooden rollers, and brute slave labor.
That laughter is the real weapon. It's so much worse than an argument. You can fight an argument with data. You can't fight a laugh.
It just strips you of your dignity.
That laughter is the sound of testimonial injustice. This is a brilliant concept from the philosopher Miranda Fricker. Testimonial injustice happens when you are denied credibility, not because of the content of what you said, but entirely because of who you are. Elias is an outsider. He's a guy from a machine shop in the Midwest. He doesn't have the right PhD from the right Ivy League university. Therefore, in their eyes, he cannot possibly have discovered something that the credentialed experts missed.
It's a completely closed loop.
Yeah.
It's them saying, we are the experts because we know the truth. You cannot possibly know the truth because you are not an expert, so go away.
And this creates a wall of what we call willful hermeneutical ignorance.
Oh, hermeneutical, that is a heavy $10 word.
Yes. Hermeneutics is basically the art and science of interpretation. It's the underlying software code we use to understand and categorize the world around us. So willful hermeneutical ignorance is like having a computer system that stubbornly refuses to install the driver required to read a brand new file format.
Right, it just says file unreadable and deletes it.
Exactly. The academic institution refuses to learn the language of Elias's evidence. They literally don't want to understand it because understanding it, taking his math seriously, would mean their entire linear timeline of human technological progress is wrong. It would mean their textbooks are obsolete.
So Elias is standing there, totally humiliated. His life's work, his rigorous math, is turned into a punchline by people who didn't even read it, and the rage sets in.
And this is the crucial pivot point. Most people in Elias's shoes would just crumble. The weight of that institutional rejection is crushing. They would go home, get deeply depressed, and just give up. But Elias used that rage. He looked at that closed door and realized, they will never, ever let me in, so I have to build my own house.
The text we analyze specifically calls this the pursuit of technical sovereignty.
Yes. Elias and his community completely stopped trying to publish in Nature or Science. They walked away from the institutions. And they started building their own state-of-the-art labs in barns and garages across the Midwest. They pooled their money to buy high-end oscilloscopes, geological sensors, ground-penetrating radar. They literally created a parallel, sovereign scientific community.
This is what really strikes me about this. In media, we usually frame this kind of subculture as anti-science. We say these people are rejecting science and retreating into fantasy. But listening to Elias, it sounds like he deeply, profoundly loves science. He's angry precisely because the institution of science stopped being scientific. It stopped being curious.
That is the beautiful tragedy of it. His anger is actually a fiercely protective response. He is trying to protect the scientific method from the scientific institution. He is essentially saying to that panel, you guys are playing campus politics and protecting your egos. I am doing actual physics. Now, whether his acoustic levitation physics is ultimately right or wrong is almost beside the point for this discussion. Yep. The profound point is that his anger created a completely new space for inquiry that would not exist otherwise. It forced a counter-story into existence.
It's anger as fuel. Like the quote says, burn empty or move forward. He chose to move forward. He used the heat to build an engine.
But we have to recognize that there is a limit to what one angry engineer can do in a garage. What happens when the stakes aren't just intellectual debates about ancient history? What happens when the epistemic violence is quite literally poisoning you?
Right. Elias can afford to retreat and build a lab. But not everyone has the luxury of retreating. Which brings us to the power of the collective. We really have to talk about how this righteous anger functions in environmental justice movements. Because here, the anger isn't about defending a timeline or a theory. It's about bare survival. It's life and death.
We need to look at the mothers of East Los Angeles Mel Air. This happened back in the 80s and 90s. The state government quietly decided to build a massive toxic waste incinerator and later a state prison right through the middle of their neighborhood.
And the unspoken assumption by the politicians and the developers, obviously, was that this specific community wouldn't fight back. They were predominantly low income, mostly Latino. Many of them didn't speak perfect English. The state completely counted on their silence. They expected submission.
They were banking on a majoritarian story that characterizes mothers, especially minority mothers, as passive, purely domestic, and totally apolitical. But these women completely flipped the script on them. They organized. They said, I am a mother. My fundamental job is to protect my children. Therefore, taking to the streets and fighting this toxic incinerator is my maternal duty.
There's a very specific story in the research notes about a public town hall hearing with an oil representative. And I really want to talk about this because it just makes my blood boil just reading the transcript. The community is desperately asking why this hazardous pipeline has to go right through their residential streets, right past their schools. Someone in the crowd asks, logically, why not run it along the coastline? It's a shorter route. And the oil rep, who is wearing a suit, very calm, very professional, giving off serious Sarah's boardroom energy. He leans into the microphone and says, well, we can't do that.
Yeah.
If the pipe burst along the coast, it would severely endanger the marine life.
Just let the sheer audacity of that hang in the air for a second.
And a woman in the back of the room stands up. She's physically shaking. And she screams at him, "You value the fish more than our children."
That moment, that specific scream, that is not someone losing control. That is the polite mask falling off the monster.
Yes.
The oil rep was using the calm, sanitized language of risk assessment and environmental impact statements. He was making the slow poisoning of a marginalized community sound like a neutral math problem. It was bureaucratic violence. And that mother's anger cut right through the red tape. It violently exposed the underlying logic. We think your children are disposable.
It's what the literature calls caring as resistance.
Exactly. If she didn't deeply love her children, she wouldn't be enraged. The anger is the absolute proof of the care. It's the immune system of the community aggressively attacking a pathogen.
And we saw this exact same dynamic play out on a massive scale at Standing Rock with the water protectors.
Standing Rock was an absolute masterclass in this. You had indigenous elders, grandmothers, and youth standing on a freezing bridge, facing down fully militarized police forces, attacked dogs, and water cannons in sub-zero temperatures. And the state desperately tried to frame them as rioters. The media tried to frame their anger as mindless violence.
But they completely rejected that framing. They didn't even call themselves protesters. They explicitly called themselves water protectors.
And that is a brilliant example of rhetorical sovereignty. They flat out refused to use the language of the enemy. And the resistance was rooted in this incredible concept called survivance. This is a term coined by the Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Weisner.
Survivance. It sounds a lot like survival, but it obviously implies something much more active.
Right, because survival is just the bare minimum of not dying. You can survive in a cage. You can survive as a broken victim. Survivance is an active, undeniable sense of presence. It is a total renunciation of both dominance and victimry. It's a community standing up and saying, we are still here. We are not tragic, fading relics of the past living in museums. We are modern, we are alive, and we are the active stewards of this land.
So when they stood on that bridge, getting sprayed with freezing water, their anger wasn't just a negative reaction like, we hate the oil company. It was a profound, positive assertion. We love the water. We are the water.
It was sacred anger. It was an anger that spans generations. It connects the wisdom of the ancestors directly to the lungs of the unborn. And that connection, that deep vertical connection through time, is the only thing that gave them the strength to stand there in the freezing cold. You cannot endure that kind of physical trauma for a catchy political slogan. You can only endure it for a sacred truth.
That idea of connecting to the ancestors, that really hits hard. Because for so many people around the world, that specific connection has been violently severed. Not necessarily by pipelines or bulldozers, but by history books, by the official narrative.
And this is the final and perhaps deepest piece of the puzzle we're exploring today. We've talked about technical anger with Elias. We've talked about political and environmental anger with the mothers and the water protectors. But we have to talk about spiritual anger. The very quiet, very deep anger of the historically orphaned.
I had a story buried in a forum, a very deep internet rabbit hole, about a young man named Omar living in Cairo today. He describes this daily routine where he walks past the pyramids of Giza on his way to work at a mundane corporate call center. And he talks about experiencing what he calls a historical phantom limb syndrome.
Explain how he means that.
Well, you know how if someone tragically loses an arm, their brain still feels the fingers clenching. They feel sensations in a limb that is no longer physically there. Omar looks at the pyramids, these unimaginably massive, mathematically flawless, precision-engineered structures, and his soul feels a direct, buzzing connection to the absolute genius that built them. He feels it in his blood. But the official history books, the Western archaeologists, the tourist brochures, they all tell him a completely different story. They tell him, your ancestors were just brute laborers. They dragged rocks up dirt ramps with ropes. They were superstitious primitives who worshipped animal gods.
So he feels this immense towering greatness in his DNA, but the dominant narrative constantly tells him he comes from nothing but sweat and dirt.
He writes that he feels like a tenant in a magnificent house that his own father built, but someone else has stolen the deed and locked him in the basement. And he's angry. He is quietly, furiously angry, not at the tourists taking selfies, but at the sheer theft of his historical potential. He calls his process of researching alternative history soul archaeology.
Soul archaeology. That is a profoundly beautiful concept. In psychology, we often talk about moral injury in the context of war, like when a soldier is ordered to do something that deeply violates their core conscience, and it breaks something inside them. But Omar is suffering from a historical moral injury. He is being systematically forced to accept a story of his own past that violently degrades his dignity.
He believes the pyramids were machines. He truly believes they were acoustic power plants, very similar to the atmospheric resonance blueprints Alara found in London. Now, again, I have no idea if that's historically or scientifically true. Mainstream Egyptologists would scream pseudoscience and run him out of the room. But reading Omar's words, listening to his anger, I realized something important. It actually doesn't matter if it's true in the strict peer-reviewed textbook sense. What matters is that he is actively reaching for a narrative that grants him agency.
He is flatly refusing to be a primitive. He is reclaiming his technical sovereignty. If he unquestioningly accepts the mainstream story, he is just the descendant of expendable slaves. But if he accepts his own story, the story that his righteous anger is pushing him toward, he is the proud descendant of master engineers, astronomers, and architects of energy.
That reframing changes absolutely everything about his life. It changes how he walks down the street in Cairo. It changes how he views his own capacity to learn and build. It changes his entire future.
And that is the ultimate highest function of this righteous rage we've been talking about. It is a map. Omar's anger is an internal compass pointing him directly towards self-respect. If he suppressed that anger, if he just smiled, swallowed his pride, and agreed with the tour guides to be polite, he would be spiritually dead inside. He would be, as the quote says, burning empty. But by listening to the anger, by leaning into it, he is moving forward. He's reading. He is studying physics. He is learning the complex math of his ancestors. He is resurrecting his heritage.
It's just incredible to think about the invisible thread running through all of these different lives.
I mean, we started this whole conversation with Sarah in the glass boardroom.
Suffocating her own truth just to keep a corporate job.
Right. And then we moved to Alara in the archives, who risked her entire academic career and reputation to save those blueprints from being erased.
To Elias in the Midwest, who literally built his own laboratory when the gates of the university were slammed in his face.
To the brave mothers in Los Angeles and the water protectors at Standing Rock, who used their physical bodies to jam the gears of the machine.
And finally to Omar, quietly rebuilding his own soul in the shadow of the pyramids.
In every single one of these cases, the world looked at them and said, calm down. Be reasonable, lower your voice, accept the narrative. And in every single case, their anger was the one and only thing that whispered, no, there's more, you deserve more.
We are taught from a very young age to fear our anger. We are taught that it makes us ugly, that it makes us monsters. But looking at these stories, looking at Alara, Elias, the mothers, Omar, I don't see monsters at all. I see guardians. I see people who loved the truth and loved their communities so fiercely that they were willing to burn for it.
Because anger is a boundary. It is the internal alarm system that trips the moment a fundamental line of human dignity is crossed. And if you let society dismantle your alarm system in the name of being polite, you don't become safe. You just become defenseless.
That brings me right back to Sarah's white knuckles under the conference table. At the beginning of this, I really thought they were a sign of her breaking under the pressure.
Yeah.
Now I see them as a sign of her holding on for dear life to the last shred of reality in a room completely full of lies.
And maybe that's the real takeaway here. When you look at the world, don't look at the polite smiles, look at the knuckles.
We'll catch you in the next one.